If you would, please. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As you pointed out, my name is Earl Lewis. I currently serve as the chief engineer for the state of Kansas and work within the Department of Agriculture in our Division of Water Resources. And so I'll go over what that means here in a minute and kind of how we're organized. So what I might do, if I can take just a second here, is to pull up the PowerPoint and see if I can share that. And hopefully you have both some written testimony that gives you some facts and figures about what we are doing at the division, as well as the PowerPoint. Let's, did we share the wrong one? Yeah. Here.
Question. Representative Riley. Well, we can.
While he's getting that going. So again, appreciate that. My background is I grew up on a family farm in Osage County. For those of you that don't know exactly where that's at, it's about 45 minutes south of here, between two towns called Melbourne and Quintamo. We did kind of a mix, pretty small farm, but we did a lot of row crop, always had about 40 or 50 head of beef cattle, and when I was really young, ran a small dairy as well. Graduated from high school at Merzine Valley, which was kind of combined school from those communities in 1986. Went to KU, graduated with an engineering degree in 1992, and then went to work with the Division of Water Resources, first as a summer intern, my last year or two there at KU, and then started off in water use, compliance, and enforcement. And so one of the very first things that I got involved with was the Wet Walnut Creek Iguka. I think Professor Burks or Professor Griggs mentioned this yesterday as as maybe the most famous Iguka in the state. Got an opportunity to work on some of the compliance and enforcement associated with meters and some of the issues with the allocations there. Later that same year, by December, then I moved over into what's called the Basin Team at the time, also with DWR, working with the Rattlesnake Creek and water conservation. And so the issues with Rattlesnake Creek and Quivira that Burke talked about yesterday go clear back, for me anyway, clear back to 1992. By the mid-90s, I moved over and was working on interstate litigation, particularly the Republican River litigation with Nebraska and Colorado. In 99, I moved over to the Kansas Water Office, and I think you heard from Connie Owen, the director of the Water Office, maybe last week. And so I started out in reservoirs and a lot of technical work there, obviously with my engineering background. Worked my way up into planning and served as the assistant director there from 2007 until 2018, and was the director at the Water Office from 18 until just November, and so moved back over to be the chief engineer at the Division of Water Resources just over 2.5 months ago now. So that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it for now anyway. But I appreciate, I've had a chance to work with a number of you, and it's good to see familiar faces, and certainly in a little bit different role that I've talked to you about before, but really happy to be able to be here today and talk to you about what we're doing at the Division of Water Resources, where we fit in the world. Obviously, you've talked about some of the issues we're facing, and be happy to answer questions, and I'll cover a little bit of that as we go through. But I think the chairman, and obviously I've tried to listen in to make sure that I'm not repeating a lot of what you've already heard, not waste your time. But as I understand it, kind of the first and foremost thing, again, is where do we fit within the state government? What's our primary role? What's our budget? What do we do? Those kind of things. And so we'll hit on some of those things. And again, try and cover as much ground as we can and try and answer whatever questions you have. So again, what's the role of the Division of Water Resources? Actually, DWR as an entity has been around for a long time. Our roots go clear back. There's actually laws that pertain to water allocation, water rights, those type of things go clear back into the late 1800s. Our beginning really started with an irrigation commission that was to help promote, manage irrigation. It was beginning to develop clear back in 1917, and then it was combined with another entity in state government into the Division of Water Resources in 1927, and so put into what was in the Board of Agriculture, and it's really been in that, some form of that really since 1927. So things have changed, and I know Dr. Griggs talked quite a bit yesterday about the Appropriation Act and it coming into play in 1945, and again, we'll come back to that in a minute. And changes in 1957, and again, we'll hit on a few of those as we go along here. Our role, there's 30 different laws that we administer or have some piece of in the state of Kansas. Obviously, the biggest one being the Appropriation Act, which governs how water is allocated in the state of Kansas, but also we have a Water Structures Division or program that works with dams, levees, those kind of things to help protect life and reduce property damage. We also manage the state's 4 interstate water compacts, and I serve as one of the primary commissioners on each of those. And if we look at what we'd say, our mission really is within the overall Department of Agriculture, and I think our primary mission is to try and serve the system of the state as best we can to, again, allocate that water, help manage those things. But again, try and manage our programs, do that as efficiently, as effectively, and fairly as we can to all our users across the state. So that's kind of what we're about. Where do we live? Where do we report to? I already mentioned we're within the Kansas Department of Agriculture. And there's 5 primary divisions: agribusiness services, agricultural marketing, water resource conservation. So you can see those there. And there's a number in animal health. So there's a number of those in animal health and agribusiness services that have different pieces. I think you'll hear from Andy Lyon with Division of Conservation tomorrow. So I won't go into any of his stuff other than the things we might have a little bit of overlap. I'll try and touch on that, and then he can cover his part of that as well. Our division, yes, sir.
Just for everybody's information, the Kansas Department of Agriculture now is located in Manhattan, Kansas.
Correct.
It's not in the Topeka area, so just so that everybody knows. Thank you.
Bet. And so our division, we have about 75 to 80 employees, depending on how the budget shakes out each year. Our division is broken up into 3 different programs: water appropriations, water management services, and water structures. And again, I'll come back to those in just a little bit. Water appropriations is led by Lane Letourneau, and I think many of you have heard from Lane if you've been around for a few years. He's a regular here in the Capitol answering questions and providing information. Water management services is led by Chris Badel, and then water structures is led by Terry Medley. And so want to make sure and give those folks credit because they really do the main bulk of making sure the agency is running efficiently. As the chairman just mentioned, we are located in Manhattan, but we also have field offices. More than probably half our staff is located in the field offices. We want to get folks out a little closer to the work, if you will. So we have field offices here in Topeka, and a satellite office from Topeka in Parsons, which actually just has one person in Parsons. We have a field office in Stafford, a field office in Stockton covering the northwest portion, and then in Garden City covering southwest Kansas. And so again, we have a water commissioner in each of those areas and staff that really do the bulk of the day-to-day going out and looking at folks' water rights, if they're in compliance, helping folks that come into the office with questions, helping out fill out applications, and a lot of the work really goes on at the field offices. And then the headquarters certainly handles any of the more complicated applications or some of the bigger policy questions or the interstate things, and a lot of our technical work goes on at the headquarters, but a lot of the day-to-day activity where a lot of our folks interact with the public happens at our field offices. Again, I mentioned we have 3 programs, and we had 30 statutes that we have some piece of. You can see on the screen kind of the primary ones that we deal with, the major ones, and again, how we organize ourselves within the division. Again, the Water Appropriation covers the Water Appropriation Act. Professor Grigg mentioned the Groundwater Management Districts. That act came into place in 1972. The Water Plan Storage Act, you may have heard from Connie Owen on that. The primary implementer of the Water Plan Storage Act is the Kansas Water Office. And that's the act that gives the state the ability to purchase storage in the federal reservoirs and then market that storage out to municipal industrial customers. The division has a role in the fact that those programs have a water right for that storage, a reserved water right. But then if they are making releases to downstream interests, we have a responsibility to protect those releases from other users picking those up. So that's our piece of that. The Water Transfer Act came into being in 1983, and that is certainly one of the things that you may have heard a little bit about, and is what would be implemented with the Hayes, Russell, and R9 transfer that's still pending out there. That's really governed by the Water Transfer Act. And so ultimately, assuming that it gets through a district court, and the district court upholds the order that the chief engineer, my predecessor, issued, then that would go to a transfer panel, which is composed of myself, Connie Owen as the director of the Water Office, and then the head of the Division of Environment of KDA-DIVISION to evaluate whether or not the public interest is better to leave that water where it's at, in this case in Edwards County, or transfer it to Hayes and Russell. And there's a pretty well-defined procedure for the things that we would look at and the process we would go through. And so that would be something that we might expect over the next 12 to 18 months would be something that we'll be addressing there. Water Banking Act came into being in the Assurance Program Act in the mid-'80s. And again, is much, again, like the Water Marketing Program or the Water Storage Act, primarily run by the Kansas Water Office. And we have a role in, again, the water rights and then the releases, protecting the releases from storage for downstream interest. So again, that's a place where we've got some overlap with, or some coordination with another state agency. Water Banking Act in 2001, we currently have one water bank in the state of Kansas associated with Groundwater Management District number 5 in South Central Kansas. And again, that's a tool that was put in place to provide some flexibility and create a water market. And they've been in place now for, as you can see, not quite 20 years. Water Management Services is where we do a lot of our technical work, but it's also where we house our work related to the interstate compacts. And so Republican River Compact in 1943, the Kansas-Colorado Arc Compact, again, I think you heard a little bit about that yesterday. The Kansas-Oklahoma Arc River Compact, which we don't hear very much about because there's very rarely any conflict with that, nor with the Big Blue Compact, which came in the 70s with Nebraska. And I'll come back to those in a little bit. Our Water Structures Program, again, some of our oldest statutes with the levees and obstruction of streams going back to 1929. And obstruction of streams really is where we house, say, the dam safety or the dam permitting is within that act. That's what gives us the authority and the responsibility to do those. The Watershed District Act in 1953, the primary state entity that deals with the Watershed District Act is with the Division of Conservation. Again, I think probably Andy and I might talk about that tomorrow. We have a role as being the state's engineering arm as related to water to review those plans as they come in, make sure their general plan is adequate to address the issues, and that when they're building those structures that they're up to state code. That's our primary role there. Floodplain zoning came in 1991, and we also helped to run the state's National Flood Insurance Program. And again, our overall goal there is we've seen repeated damages from flooding, particularly for property, to try and get folks in the flood insurance, or ideally get zoning so that we don't have people building in places that flood often, so we reduce damage. That's the primary issue there. If we think about water, and again, I know you heard from Dr. Butler on Monday. He may have covered some of this. I didn't catch all of his presentation, so if he did, I apologize for repeating it. But I think it's a good foundation to make sure we all understand 85% of the water use in the state of Kansas is for irrigation. If we look at municipal, it's about 8, industrial is about 3. There's another 3 or 4% that go to other things such as recreation or artificial recharge, those kind of things. So, but the bulk is 85%. So the map we have up on the screen, we call the Pac-Man map, and the size, there's a pie chart for each county in the state of Kansas. The size of that pie chart is representative of the amount of water that is used in that county. And this is from 2016. The numbers vary a little bit from year to year, but not dramatically. And in this case, blue, as you might expect from what I've just said, represents irrigation. The red is municipal. As you can see, the areas, Wichita, Topeka, Lawrence, Manhattan, Johnson County are big municipal users. And then the yellow is industrial. And again, if you look at where some of those are, Coffee County, Pottawatomie County, our biggest industrial users are our power plants, where we have evaporative cooling. That's our biggest user. And I know there was a question about the ethanol plants, I think maybe yesterday or the day before. And certainly they are a significant user locally, but on the statewide scale, they're not a huge user. And so I can come back and talk about that again. So overall, we use a little under 4 million acre-feet of water a year. And again, so an acre-foot of water is the amount of water that would take to cover 1 acre of property 1 foot deep. And so 326,000 gallons roughly, if you want to put it in 1,000 gallons. Again, the majority, as you can see, is used for irrigation in south central, southwest, northwest Kansas. And again, as you might expect, primarily from groundwater. So hopefully this map you're going to see coming up, we have moved over time. I talked a little bit about the history of the division, but our focus as a state on what we're trying to accomplish related to water has changed over time. And so the map we have coming up, and hopefully it'll loop through, if not, I'll come back and get it again, is the number of points of diversion. And a point of diversion means either a well or a pump site on a stream. And so those number of points of diversion that we see in the state of Kansas each year going from the early 40s, and I think this ends up in 2017. And so you can see the growth. It's not going to loop. Let me go back and have that do it one more time. You can see the growth kind of explode here in the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s. And again, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know. A lot of that is tied to development of technology with pumps, a lot of new wells coming in, and obviously center pivot irrigation made a lot of ground irrigable that was not previously irrigable. And so those factors kind of came into being. And then you can match those things up with the changes that Dr. Griggs talked about yesterday with the 1957 work that was done, where we started to see a little bit of development in the Ogallala. 1972 groundwater management district, where we saw that in that case, we've kind of flipped a little bit, in all honesty, because at that time, the chief engineer was named Guy Gibson, and there was a lot of development going on, and there was a lot of local concern that we had unfettered development and that there was going to be no regulation. And so if I had a property right, a water right, I wanted to make sure it was going to be protected, and there was concern that it was not going to be, that the state was not going to step forward. Until 1978, you didn't actually have to have a water right to go out and drill a well and start using water. You could go do that. Now, the state wouldn't protect that water right if you didn't have one, but there was no law that said I can go out, put a hole in the ground, put up a center pivot, and start running it as much as I wanted to, unregulated, essentially. So in 1978, there was another task force put together that looked at a whole host of things, and one of those things was making it a requirement to actually have a water right before you went out and put water to use. Made some changes to the Groundwater Management District Act. That's where a lot of the IGUCA and a lot of controls started coming in. And so we started to see that change, and you can start to see that change also with the number of water rights that are being developed. We started seeing areas be cut back in the early 80s for further development, and really from the 80s until the early to mid 90s is when we saw the majority of the areas in the state that are currently closed get to be closed, which means you can file for a new application and give us the money for the application, but we can't approve it. So normally we tell people before they actually submit the application that we can't approve it, so they don't send us a $400 check, but we still have people to do it. But most of those areas are closed, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think the key here is we've gone from an era of development in really the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and in the 80s we transferred over from a development to a management kind of era, and now we're getting more into trying to be more conservation. And so again, some of our statutory tools have followed that as well as we've made our way through the time here. And again, this is kind of harder for you to see, but these are essentially screenshots of where we were at in 40, 50, 60, each of the decades. You can look at this again afterwards if you want, but again, it kind of gives you a snapshot, a decadal snapshot over time of the number of points of diversion and how that looked. Again, in the green, I forgot to mention here, the green are groundwater wells. The red on those maps are surface water diversions. And so again, obviously you see more red in the eastern part of the state, more green in the western part of the state, because obviously we've got more groundwater in the west and more surface water in the east. So what does it mean? What is our application process? Just to give you some idea what that means. So we have about 39,000 active points of diversion, about 31,000 active water rights in the state of Kansas that we monitor and get water use reports from every single year. But if you were in an area that was not closed and you wanted to get a water right, and I think Dr. Griggs talked about this yesterday, you would file with our office an application for a new water right that would say, I want to pump a certain quantity of water from a certain place at a certain rate, and I'm going to use it for this use on this property. We would then look at that application, make sure that it didn't impair any other water rights or didn't have any potential to impair other water rights that were already in existence. And the statute requires that if we do that and it appears that that new use is not going to impair any other use, then we're required to approve it. And so that process happens. We go through that, make sure that nobody else is going to be hurt or impaired. Assuming that they're not, we issue a permit to appropriate water, then go out and develop their water right then. Their next step is then to drill the well, put in all the plumbing. If it's irrigation, they put up a center pivot, whatever they need to do to get their project ready to go to put water to beneficial use. At that point, they let us know. We go out and do a field inspection, make sure that their diversion works are completed. Then they put water to beneficial use. So they start pumping water. Your water right, you develop your water right. The state doesn't give you a water right. It gives you the ability to develop a water right. Right? It's a subtle distinction, but we don't give out water rights. We give out the ability for somebody to develop a water right. And so once you put water to use for beneficial purposes defined by the Act, you put it to use, then that's how you develop a water right. Right? Your actions of putting water on the ground or through the city pipes or in the industry, that is what develops the water right, the property right. After 5 years, typically, it's called a perfection period. That would give you about 5 years to put water to use. And we try and make sure that there's dry years, wet years, especially for irrigation. We go out and look at your water use history, look at your property. We do what's called a field inspection and go out and sit down with the owner and look at all their works and look at all their records. And then put together what's called a certificate of appropriation. And that really is what then you as an owner of land would take to the Register of Deeds to say, here is my property right, right? At that point, it would define how much of a water right you have developed based on the parameters that you were given, within the parameters you were given under your permit. After that point, you're free to continue using water as long as you're not impairing anybody else. And as Dr. Griggs laid out, if we get into impairment, then we've got a whole set of rules of how we go about addressing one user's access to water versus another on the prior appropriation system. We can again, I think as Professor Griggs talked about yesterday, you can come in, let's say you had an irrigation right, and that ethanol plant is developing right across the road. Now they need water. You're in an area they can't get their own water right because it's closed. They come and say, I'd like to buy your water right. You agree. So now the ethanol plant comes in, says, I want to change the place of use. I want to change the use made of water. And depending on the situation, maybe I want to move the well across the road. Again, we'll look at that, make sure that any of those changes aren't going to impair or significantly impact other users in that area. And if they're not, then we can approve it. In that case, if we're moving from one use to another, the other thing we do to make sure that we're protecting other water rights and protecting the resource is what's called the consumptive use evaluation, right? If you think about, and again, most of our water rights are for irrigation, so most of the changes when we change from one use to another are from irrigation to municipal or to industrial. Not exclusively, but that's the vast majority of them. And so if you think about how irrigation use is based on how much water, how much rain we get, right? The more rain you get, the less you're going to pump. That's just typical and common sense because it's going to cost me to pump water. So if I don't have to pump, I'm not going to do it. Some people have a different tolerance for how much rain they want to get before they turn off the pumps, but that's a whole different discussion. But we would see that some years are going to pump the whole amount. Some years are going to pump half. Maybe they get a really wet year, they don't pump any. And so the amount of water that you use, if you got a 100-acre-foot water right and it's for irrigation, over a 5 or 10 year period, you're not going to use 100 acre feet every single year. On average, it's about 70% of that. So on average, it's about 70 acre feet. That would be the amount we would allow to be transferred over to municipal or industrial or other use. Primarily because we'd expect that industrial user is not going to have that same sensitivity to climate, right? They're going to use that 70 acre feet every single year. And so we want to make sure that when we make that change, we're not impacting other users and we're not impacting the resource any more than that existing certified right was already developed for. And so that's another change we make in there. A couple more things, just to make things more complicated. This is how you develop a permanent long-term water right. We also have situations where people come in, may have a very short-term project, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We have term permits, and we end up doing about 100 of those every single year. We have a number of things that come in that may be less than an acre foot or two for a very small project, for a construction project, for something else. And in those cases, we have temporary permits, and we have 300 of those on average every year. When the oil and gas boom is going pretty big, maybe we do 500 of those every year. So we get about 400 applications for a permanent water right every single year. About 300 of those get approved. And so that's about how many new water rights are coming online every single year. And again, that means we get about 300 field inspections and ultimately about 300 certifications just because of the timing that comes along with the development. As I mentioned, the state is not completely open to new appropriations. So the map that we see up on the screen, anything in purple is closed to new appropriations. And so you have to get a waiver to the existing regulations. You've got to have some really good reason before we would approve a new application in these areas. That's very, very rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's very, very rare. In most of those cases, if you want to put a new project in, you want to have water in those areas, you need to go get water from somebody else and go through that change process. So again, we're not increasing the consumptive use of that resource. Some of those other areas are limited, so there's opportunity for maybe spots here and there, but in general, you can see the majority of those areas are closed. Those are primarily groundwater areas, the purple areas, and again, those you can kind of see the outline there of the groundwater management districts. A lot of the purple areas, especially in the western part of the state, correspond to the outline of those groundwater management districts. Again, in the late 80s, early to mid 90s, most of those districts were closed to new appropriation. As we saw that our groundwater levels were declining, which of course means that now we have more water use than Mother Nature is giving us water to use. A couple of things, again, I mentioned that we've kind of moved from development to management. Now we're trying to move into more of an area of conservation. And I think the chairman mentioned that our agency, and I appreciate your willingness to have the multi-year flex account bill be introduced this year. That is a tool that came out of the drought of 2012, 2013. We had a lot of water use, especially in areas that are primarily groundwater dependent. A lot of folks that were over pumping had got to the end of the year and really needed more water just because of how dry that was. And so at that point, created what's called a drought term permit. So it was a 2-year permit. So if somebody needed to go over their authorized quantity 1 year, then we would take an equal amount from their ability to pump next year. So it gave people an opportunity to finish out the year, but then plan for the following year. Maybe their cropping, they changed their cropping or whatever, so that they would know going into the following year, I don't have as much water to deal with. Save their crop and gave us, with the net being no additional water use from the aquifer. That led to the thought of, that worked out really well. Maybe we ought to do that instead of over a 2-year period, but over a 5-year period. And so that developed the multi-year flex account. And again, we've got a number of those that we do each year. And again, a lot of those are in that same situation where folks maybe are up against it 1 year, but they can borrow from the next year or two to try and make sure that we don't have an increased impact on the aquifer while giving them the flexibility to manage their own operation and get the most economic benefit out of their operation they can. And so it's a little bit of a balance of the resource versus the economy. We don't make that multi-year flex count, whatever, again, going back to, let's say that you had that 100 acre feet, it's not 100 times 5, you don't get 500 acre feet. Again, we look at what the net irrigation requirement is and say, maybe you get 5 times that 70 or that 80 acre feet. Again, so now you get a little bit of benefit because you can manage your water use over time, but our goal is to make sure there's no net impact on the aquifer. Water conservation areas are something that came out of the Water Vision, and I know that Connie Owen talked about this a little bit, was an effort where we have individual producers or a group of producers that come in and say, I'm concerned about the future of the aquifer in my area. I want to get my conservation in place. I want to document it. And we have an agreement between the division and that user that says they're going to use less water. We're going to give them some flexibility over time, and maybe if they have a few wells between their wells, so they get a little benefit from flexibility. We get some water conservation. Again, we get to extend the life of the aquifer. We've got a number of those, and I'll come back to that here in just a minute. Across the state, it's been a pretty successful tool. Burke also talked about the local enhancement management area, and now that we've got 3 of those in place. And again, that is a plan. It's kind of like the water conservation area, but it covers an entire area. And so he talked about Sheridan 6, Northwest Kansas GMD 4, and now Wichita County, which we're getting in place. Again, those are ones where an entire area, all the users that are not vested users are in the same boat. They are all taking some level of cut. And depending on which LEMA, they all set those up just a little bit differently. That's kind of the beauty of this, and I know Burke touched on this a little bit, but it's really driven by the local groundwater management district to say, here's what our goal we want to have. We've looked at the modeling that says if I do, again, like you talked about in Sheridan 6, if I do a 20% cut, I'm going to expect the life of my aquifer to be extended by 25 years. That was their goal. And so they obviously exceeded that, which we're happy about, but it really says, here's my goal, here's how I'm going to cut back to achieve that goal. And so it's really locally driven, puts us in a position where we hold the hearing, make a determination whether it meets the statutes and meets their goals or not. But it doesn't put us in a position of being as much top down and coming and saying, now you've got to do it this way. So I think it's been very successful, and we're encouraged that it continues to develop in new areas. Excuse me. Interstate compacts, again, the map shows the 4 areas or the 4 basins that are covered by interstate compacts. Again, the first one being the Republican River Basin. Just to be clear, we don't have any active litigation going on right now with any of our compacts. So that's a good thing and have it for a few years. We finished one up with a Republican here 5 or 6 years ago, probably, at this point. We continue to work. We meet with our sister agencies in Nebraska and Colorado. We were meeting every single month for a while in person. We're now down to meeting every couple months to make sure that things are still online and trying to resolve any remaining issues that need to be cleaned up. Our relationship, I think, has changed dramatically over the last 3 to 4 years. Much more, we've dealt with a lot of the sticky issues and now have much more cooperative and working relationship than we did before. The Kansas-Colorado, again, I think Burke touched on this quite a bit yesterday, going back, and actually the first lawsuits on this go clear back to the early 1900s. We've sued Colorado 3 times, and the first time we got essentially kicked out. Second time got kicked out, but the Supreme Court said, get a compact and then come back. And so that's really what led to development of the compact. And then, of course, the one in 1985 when we went back and said, you still aren't following the compact, and we actually had the legal basis to sue and win. There's still, again, like with the Republican, there's still some issues that are not the big issues, but they are issues that we continue to work with them on both quantity and quality. And we'll do so for several years, I'm sure. So the Republican is a compact that doesn't necessarily define how much water we get at the state line, but it divides up the water supply of the basin on a percentage basis. And so it's a little complicated, but if you think about, again, if you have a wetter year, you have more water supply, that means we get more water supply, but it's based on the percentage of water supply for any given year. The ARC is somewhat like that, but there is much more of they have to deliver water to the state line. There's a certain amount they have to make sure it gets to the state line, and then once it gets to Kansas, it's used by irrigation ditches in western Kansas, but it's really outside the compact at that point. The Kansas-Oklahoma compact is primarily a compact that defines how much storage each state can build in their state. And so it's a different animal than the other two. It's not based on how much water flows across the state line, but as you might think about it, a lot of that area is wetter than we see in the ARC or in the Republican. And so we've got a lot of development from not only Corps of Engineers, but watershed districts and state lakes and city lakes. And so it's a compact that defines how much Oklahoma can build versus how much Kansas can build. And the good news is, from our perspective, we could build quite a bit more storage and still be in line with the compact. The blue compact with Nebraska is the latest one in 1971, also has a state line flow requirement. This is the only one that has specifically a water quality component. There's actually a water quality committee a subcommittee of the compact itself. And so that's, as you might expect, you think about it over time, what was happening in the early 70s, that's when we're starting to see a lot of concern with water quality and environmental issues across the nation. And so that has been reflected into our compact. Again, just so you all are aware, on the Republican, I, as the chief engineer, serve as the sole compact commissioner on the Republican. On the blue, there is one other compact commissioner, and the governor just named Dr. Kenneth Berger, who lives in Manhattan, to that one. The Kansas-Colorado ARC has 2 other commissioners, Randy Hazlett and Troy Demler, who are both from Lakin and Garden City area, are on that commission. And then the Kansas-Oklahoma also has 2 other folks. And again, the governor just named Lisa French and Representative Punkawee Victors on that as well. So those will be their first year for those folks, if you're interested in talking to them about this as well. So again, just a few facts. Water conservation areas, we have 53 plans, and that does not include, we talked a little bit, I think, or Burke talked a little bit yesterday about Wichita County. So there's a Wichita County WCA plan, now there's a Wichita County Lima plan, but there's 26 individual plans in Wichita County, so that's really, add 26 on top of your 53 there. You can see covering about 12,000 acre feet a year, and 80-some thousand acres. The Limas, again, we talked about with Sheridan 6, with Northwest Kansas and now Wichita County. And I've talked a little bit about the compacts, again, meeting monthly and trying to find a path forward on the ARC, especially as it pertains to water quality. And then, again, there's still a few water quantity issues out there we're trying to resolve that might get us a little bit more water at the state line. We're right in the middle. One of the things that both Dr. Butler and Professor Griggs talked about are water use information. That went into place in 1986. In fact, one of my first summer jobs was working only on water use. What was painful, but a good learning experience. And again, we get a water use report by law. That was one of the things that happened in mid-'80s was there was a requirement that every single non-domestic water user submit a water use report by March 1st of every single year. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a penalty. We were seeing pretty good, 50 to 70% folks turning it in. But in the late 80s or 90s, there was a civil penalty put in place, $25 per water right if you didn't turn that in. And so, as you might expect, our participation in the water use program went from 50 to 70 up to 95% overnight. That really is the very basis, along with the water level measurements that Dr. Butler talked about. Those are the two primary key pieces of information related to our ability to manage our water resources in the state of Kansas. Knowing how much we use and its effect on our resource is the two primary things. There's all the pieces of other information we can collect and do, but those are the two things. We, a few years ago, implemented online water use reporting. For a few decades, we had, and we still send out a card. So if you want to send yours back in on a card, you can do that. But about 90% or better now go onto our online water use portal and report that online. And again, for several years, we had the online reporting going on, and we started out at 10 or 15 and 20 and made it up to about 30 or 40%. And during the last administration, there was an opportunity under the Secretary of Agriculture's authority to require a fee for any paper filed forms, basically. And so implemented a $20 per water right fee for anybody that sent it in. And so again, that means if you have 3 water rights, you want to send in a card, it's going to cost you $60. The thought there is that we have to have somebody then put that information into the computer. We're going to use that money to pay that person to do that for you, or you can go online and do it yourself. And again, last year we had north of 90% of the people go online. And again, they get feedback immediately. If they put something in that is way out of bounds, if they think they're reporting gallons and they mark that as acre foot, then the system will flag that you really didn't pump 3 million acre feet yourself. You might want to go back and check that. So it's a good QA/QC on the fly, and it gives that user a really good, quick understanding of how their water use relates. Over on the dam safety, and again, our structures really is about protecting property, protecting life, again, primarily from flooding, but not exclusively. Our dam safety program, again, going clear back to 1929. And actually, if you want to go back, if you think about mill ponds and that sort of thing, there's legislation that goes clear back into the 1870s about that. There are 6,000 dams that appear on the National Inventory of Dams, and so you got to meet a certain classification, so that's not a small dam. You think about farm ponds, depending on the estimate, we've got 125,000 to 200,000 farm ponds across the state of Kansas. So these are ones that store really more than 50 acre feet of water, right? Or are higher than 6 feet or higher than 25 feet if you don't store 50 acre feet. 2,500 of those are regulated by state. And again, there was a change made, I think in 2013 or 2014, that changed the regulation from being 50 acre feet to 125 acre feet at the principal spillway. And that 125 acre feet, between 50 and 125, you still have to report them, but they are not permitted or regulated by the state. We know where they're at, but we don't go out and regulate them. If you're over 125 acre feet, depending on what's downstream, defines the hazard classification. So if you think you got housing or a really busy road or something like that, it's going to be a high hazard dam. That means you better build your dam better. It also means that you're going to go out and have it inspected every 3 years and report that back to us. If it's low hazard, if there's not much down below it, some farm ground or something that's not going to be a lot of property damage, it's still over 125 acre feet, then you still need to inspect it every 5 years. But again, so that would be the significant hazard. So that's really the difference on those. The flood insurance program, again, since 1991. So we are essentially, a lot of our effort here comes as delegated from FEMA, who runs the national program. We have 455 communities that participate. 428 of those have an active, well-defined floodplain map that shows which houses or businesses are within that floodplain. 27 can participate, but don't necessarily have their map done at this point. 10,000, almost 11,000 flood insurance policies in place, and you can see almost $2 billion in properties covered by those flood insurance policies, and about $8.8 million in premiums go into the program to again, pay out claims for those folks that are as part of the program once the flood comes. And again, our overall goal here is to try and make sure that we're keeping folks from building in a spot where they could be flooded out. Or if they're building, be building only structures that are really not going to be damaged that much when the flood comes. And we do have some of those. You might think of somebody's a barn or a garage or something where they're not really storing valuable, it's not their house, they're not storing valuable stuff. It's probably okay as long as they have the ability for the water to get in and out of their structure. Just again, so that you have an idea of our permitting, last year, 52 channel changes. So anytime somebody goes out and makes a change to the course, current, or the channel, then they need to have that permitted. 52 of those, 188 levees or floodplain fills. And again, a lot of those floodplain fills are for folks that are building something and need to raise the floodplain a little bit. The thing we look at there, again, is if you put some fill or you put a levee in the floodway, what impact is that having on other folks, right? You might be protecting your property, which is a good thing, but are you shoving more water onto somebody else's property and raising the water level and flooding them more than they would have been? So that's really the issue there. Stream obstructions, so 128. And again, got 25 dams there. And then 8 floodplain ordinances. Again, we work with a lot of cities, counties to make sure that their floodplain ordinances make sense and are in compliance with the statute. From a budgetary standpoint, we can certainly follow up with individual programs if you want to, but you can see the amount of revenue varies currently $11 to $12 million per year. Right up $4 million of that is state general fund, and state general fund goes exclusively for salaries, wages, operational expenses, rents, travel, that kind of thing. The orange comes from the federal funds, and again, that's primarily from FEMA. A lot of that is pass through. We do have some of our staff, 5 or 6, that are funded from FEMA dollars for dam safety, for running the flood insurance program, but the vast majority of that, and you'll see the professional services number there is a significant number. We've got about 5 million salaries and just under 5 million in professional services. In the state accounting system, what professional services really means is we turn around, get the money from FEMA. Maybe we're working, let's say we're working with Shawnee County to update their flood map. We would then work with them and contract with a private firm to do all the hydrologic work and all the mapping to define where that 100-year or 500-year flood would be. Then that puts the county in the position to adopt ordinances to say, again, protect property. So the vast majority of that $5 million comes in from the federal government, goes right back out to private firms to do that work. The state water plan fund is in the gray, and primarily from 3 lines if you're on those committees. So basin team, I mentioned that's where I started out. The basin team works on some of our technical work and helping with compliance and enforcement. Water use, and again, that supports a lot of our online water use reporting, a lot of maintenance, so that folks can submit that. And then interstate water issues, so supporting a few of our staffs that are working, again, primarily on the Colorado, on the Ark River in Colorado and the Republican River. Agency fees, obviously we get some funds in as people pay for application fees or inspection fees, both in the appropriations and in the structures, and so that's within the yellow. And then state pass-through, we also get some money from, for example, the State Highway Fund. There's a number of projects we permit under our structures, and we both found it more efficient over time from our budget standpoint to average that out, and they send us a transfer of a little over $100,000 each year, and then we do the permits without doing individual permit fees. And so there's a little bit of state pass-through from one to the other to cover some of those ongoing work we have with other agencies. If you look at, again, you can see the numbers there yourself, with the bulk being, again, salaries and wages and professional services. If you want more information, I've left the link there. And again, we've got a tremendous amount of information. Our folks do a great job on any of these, especially these hot button issues that you might hear about, whether that's the compacts, whether that's Rattlesnake Creek or the Wichita ASR or the Hayes R9 or any of those things or the LEMAs. We have information about each of those, as well as for any user that needs to have information about applications or what the statutes and regulations say. So with that, thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Let you catch your breath for a moment. That's a lot of information in a short amount of time. The one thing that I would request from the agency is the FTEs and their location to round off all this information.
We'll get that for you.
Now, at one point, I believe it was the geologist was talking about, the question came up about recharging the Ogallala. Mm-hmm. And he mentioned briefly about damming up some of the streams to allow for that recharge. Now, would that damming come under you then?
It would.
For the permitting?
It would, yes.
Thank you.
It would, in that case, it would have both a water structures permit for well, it could depend on how big it is, but it would have it on the structures permit, but there'd also be an artificial recharge water right as well, most likely, again, depending on the size.
Most of them out there would be pretty small.
Probably.
Let's go to the questions. I have Representative Smith first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Thank you. Just actually to follow right up along your initial question there, Mr. Lewis, thank you for your presentation. What is the threshold or the limit on creating a dam on your property? Let's say I have some farmland out on my ranch. I want to build a small water retention on a draw. Is it the volume of water that it can potentially hold? Is it the acres that it drains? Where's that threshold where I need a permit, and are there different types of permits that you have to apply for?
Yeah, you bet. So as with any good government official, it depends, right? So first and foremost, if you think about a lot of the say farm pond, the statute provides that you can go out and impound up to 15 acre feet of water that doesn't need any permit at all, right? No water right, no structures, those kind of things. The statute gives an exemption for the capture and storage of anything less than 15 acre feet, no matter what you're using it for, even irrigation. Now, if you build a structure that is 50 acre feet or more, then you would need to check with the structures folks on a water structures permit. Those need to be registered. If it's between 50 and 125 acres, it needs to be registered, but it doesn't necessarily need to be permitted. If it's larger than 125 acre feet, then it needs to be permitted with the structures folks. If it's more than 15 acre feet for anything but domestic, then you would need a permit from the appropriation side. So let's say you're between 50 or 15 and 50, your structure doesn't need to be permitted, but your water right does, right? And anything over 125 acre feet needs to be permitted either way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Jennings.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Earl, welcome in your new capacity. You probably know where I'm going to go. So we had some discussion yesterday about the implications of uranium contamination in groundwater, particularly in the district that I represent, and even within the community that I live, Lakin, where it became necessary to construct a reverse osmosis plant. Actually, I think it's something else, but it does that. It takes out the uranium so that we can drink the water. And that was a $6 million project for a community with a little over 900 residential users. So spreading that cost out was a pretty hefty bill. Effectively doubled the water rates for residential users in the community to pay for that infrastructure. There certainly seems to be a lot of evidence that practices in the state of Colorado in terms of irrigation style, in terms of diverting flows, a number of other things are having some impact on all of this. you mentioned that you are a member of the compact. I'm curious, will this issue be meaningfully discussed in terms of the compact between Kansas and Colorado? And I think the professor yesterday suggested that, in fact, there might be a cause of action that could be brought. This will not get better on its own. It will not get better with time unless something changes. I'm curious about your position on this.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Jennings, and good to see you. Yeah, I could have guessed exactly where you're going to go with that, and rightfully so. You know, it is a complex issue, and I think Professor Griggs did a pretty good job of explaining it yesterday. It's not, you know, I purposely pointed out on the blue compact that it has a water quality component. On the ARC, it's got to be read into it. It is not explicit, and certainly talks about usable state line flows. And certainly, from Colorado's perspective, if you can irrigate with it, then it's usable. And so, you know, I think there could be some validity to that. I think we've got a lot of homework to do, frankly, on when it becomes unusable and for what purposes do we have something that we can take to the compact and makes a little hay with here. Just for your, and I know you know this, Representative Jennings, but for everybody else's understanding, he hit on exactly the key piece, I think, here. What the cause of this, and it's been a growing issue for decades, literally for maybe 100 years. There is what's called a pure shale in certain parts of the basin in Colorado that's fairly close to the surface. And so historically, before the 70s, 80s, and 90s particularly, but even into the 80s in many cases, Colorado farmers used what was called flood irrigation or furrow irrigation, right? So they would pump water on one end of the field, let it run to the other end of the field. That's how you irrigated your crops. A very inefficient system because you lose a lot of the water below the root zone, right? In order to get it to the end of the field, you got to dump a lot of water at the upper end, and a lot of the water goes on down through the soil, and in this case, gets onto the pure shale. When we started adding a lot of our fertilizer to that, then we get a chemical reaction, which is now beyond my understanding. We get a chemical reaction of the fertilizer with the shale that releases the sulfate and the uranium. That water then travels back through the groundwater system and back into the stream, and then comes back in, which we get on downstream to Kansas. So it's really that activity, that irrigation activity in certain parts of Colorado that is causing the issue for us and causing an issue for them too. Some of their communities on the lower end of the ARC system are having the same issue that we are experiencing in Lakin and Deerfield and Garden City. So this is not unique. It doesn't magically become polluted once it crosses the state line. It is an issue for them as well. The question, let's play that out. And again, I do think we need to do some more work here and try and make sure that we are doing our due diligence and protecting our citizens as best we can. If we take that to a lawsuit and are successful, what's the remedy? Most of those lands, or a lot of those lands, are already converted from flood to center pivot. So we're getting less water onto the pure shale. We've got a lot of that water that's already in the ground. It's going to take years, maybe decades, for that to filter back out. We're going to see significant change. In the United States, we really don't regulate non-point source pollution issues, right? We incentivize them, we recognize them, we regulate and permit point source, so city effluents, industry. We don't regulate non-point activities. This is really a non-point source pollution activity. So again, if we play that out and say we win, what do we win? Right? What is Colorado going to do? Maybe they're going to send us a big check, and that's fine. We'll take a big check. And maybe help other communities besides Lakin do what Lakin had to do. But what are we going to make them do? If we don't regulate non-point source issues, how are we going to solve the problem? We continue to work with Colorado and try and help them find more ways to line ditches, to line ponds that may be seeping, to change their irrigation practices. I think that's going to be, to me, that's the solution. Again, it may take a long time before that solution results in the water quality that we want, because we've got a lot of water in the system. It's going to take a while to drain through. But we've got to change the practice over time. There's a lot of land, there's a lot of individual farmers, a lot of individual fields we've got to deal with. So I think we're going to continue to press Colorado on that. I've been talking to my counterpart in Colorado on that about the need. We're going to try and have additional meetings yet this year to try and understand that. And again, there's some other issues on the Ark River Compact that we need to deal with. We're going to continue to push them. I'm hesitant to go to the litigation route until I know that we can be successful, right? Because once you get into state versus state and U.S. Supreme Court, it's literally millions of dollars in effort, and we need to make sure that we're going to be successful and not harm our relationship unduly and waste taxpayer dollars. So that's, again, I think the key is we've got a lot of homework to do on the legal side, and also to really define the source of the problem and what can be done and what is already being done or what needs to be done.
Does that answer your question, Representative Jennings?
Well, I appreciate the answer that's given. No, not really. I just have to say, Mr. Chairman, this problem will begin moving farther east. We have residences in the counties out there that are unable to utilize well water for consumption in their homes. The economic damage that is being done as a result of this is significant and will continue to grow unless some kind of action is taken. Deerfield, Garden City, think about the potential implications for a town the size of Garden City. I guess we're fortunate that cattle can drink all of this stuff that they want to, and their lifespan's short enough, and it doesn't materially affect the meat and that sort of thing. But people are a different story. Glowing in the dark is not something people should do, and this is a potential big impact on the economy of Southwest Kansas because people can't live where they can't have, quality drinking water. And I think we should explore the options with the Attorney General about what steps maybe should or shouldn't be taken. But simply letting this go on and on and on with no response doesn't strike me as being particularly acceptable.
I'm sure you'll keep their feet to the fire, and thank you for that. Representative Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions, if you
Go ahead.
mind, please. The first one is, when a water right is given and put into use, what is the process for the property tax then? Does it go straight to the property itself, or is there a separate tax similar to oil and gas?
Yeah, so it's simply an additional value to the property, and so it goes on the property tax. There's not another direct fee that goes to the state, for example, or anything like that. No. Now, I will qualify that just if I could here, as I step back and think about that. If you have a municipal water right, there is a fee of 6 cents per 1,000 gallons that goes to State Water Plan Fund, actually 2 fees that total 6. Industrial is 3 cents per 1,000. Stock water is 3 cents per 1,000. And then there's a fee of $1.40 per ton of fertilizer. So if you have, typically there's higher levels of fertilization on irrigation than non-irrigation because you have higher plant counts. But there's not a direct cost, especially on irrigation, for the water.
Okay, that kind of leads me to my next question is, what court will this decision be made in as far as a water transfer, like for Hayes?
Right, so the way the statute works is it's a two-part system. So let's talk about the Hayes R9. So Hayes and Russell purchased the R9 ranch. They have now filed applications to change the use made of water, the place of use, and then plumbed some of the wells. But the key is they changed from irrigation to municipal. That was their application. David Barfield, my predecessor, filed a draft approval for those changes that said, yes, you can change those from irrigation to municipal, and that's essentially where it's at. And then a number of local interests are concerned about that, filed suit in district court challenging that approval of that application, and that's still in that process. If it comes out of that process as upholding the chief engineer's decision, now it goes into the water transfer process, in which that 3-person hearing panel, considering the chief engineer, the director of the water office, and the director of the Division of Environment, appoint a hearing officer, and then there's a set of 10 public interest findings that, again, are really supposed to be based on, is it better to leave the water where it's at, or is it better to transfer it as being requested? The hearing officer will hold a hearing, and then turn that recommendation over to the 3 of us. We'll make a decision, and then again, our decision can be appealed to the district court.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we talked to Professor Griggs yesterday, he raised a couple of questions for us, and one of those was if we were to implement an explicit affirmative rather than reactive duty to restore and preserve the water resources of Kansas through your office. And I was wondering how that might change the nature of your work if we were to do something like that.
Well, I think, and I didn't catch that part of it, so if I understand what you were asking and what he was referring to, Kansas from an impairment situation is a reactive state. It's not uncommon. But if we went to the affirmative, where the state now was going to go try and determine on the front end if somebody was being impaired and then proactively protect their water right. Like I say, we have 75 or 80 staff, our numbers would go dramatically higher. We'd have that, or we'd have the amount of additional monitoring that would need to happen to know when folks are turning on their wells or turning on their pumps or not would be significantly higher. Obviously, some of that can be handled through technology these days, but I think it would create a significant additional workload beyond what we have the capacity for today.
Quick follow-up to that. In addition to the monitoring of the water rights, how would it apply to conservation if we wanted to proactively conserve Kansas's water resources?
Yeah, and there's different thoughts on this. I kind of look at these as 2 parallel activities, right? The first and primary responsibility under the Appropriation Act in the Division of Water Resources is to protect the private property rights of those folks that have developed water rights historically, right? The Appropriation Act was not put in place as a Water Conservation Act. It wasn't put in place as a Water Management Act. It was put in place as an Economic Development Act to protect investment by private individuals and industries so that the state would come out and make sure they had the water that was needed for their project. So that's our first, we still have that responsibility. There are times when we try and use the Appropriation Act as a water conservation tool. And there are aspects of it that make sense there. But I think that's where the things like the water conservation areas and the LEMAs and intensive groundwater use control areas, and there's water conservation plan requirements we can have as well. Those are the tools really that we need to be using to try and encourage conservation. And when I say conservation, what we're really meaning is we're using less water, right? Because conservation has different meaning to different folks. For some, it means I'm using water as efficiently as I can. I may not use any less, but I'm using it more efficiently. That's legitimate use of conservation as a term. When we use it, we think about using less water from the resource. And I think you've got to use those other tools which are in parallel to the Appropriation Act as the primary responsibility there.
And another follow-up to that, if that's okay.
Quickly, please.
Okay, for the LEMAs, are those actively promoted, or how are those, how do people in those districts sign up for a LEMA?
Well, they don't necessarily sign up for a LEMA, but there are a number of folks that are promoting those. Certainly, as part of the Water Vision, that was something that we've actively promoted. Our staff, as they talk to folks that are interested in conserving the resource, talk about water conservation area options, also LEMAs. In that case, let's take the one we just approved at the end of December for the all of the water rights in Wichita, all the irrigation water rights in Wichita County. There are some folks that don't really want to be in a LEMA. But when the groundwater management district develops the plan and submits the plan, everybody's in, right? That's the difference between the WCA and the LEMA. And so it's really incumbent upon the local leadership from the GMDs to be very active in trying to work with their citizens and promote this. But there is promotion at the state level as well. But we want to try and use the local leadership as much as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Representative Riley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So could you give me a little insight into where your department is as far as regulating and cooperating with the rural water districts that we have all over the state of Kansas? I drill into that a little bit. Thank you.
You bet. So our division has a couple of roles. First, most of the rural water districts would have their own wells or water supply, and so certainly we would permit any of those things under Appropriation Act permitting. We also have a responsibility, one of the other 30 acts that was not on my list, we are also the keeper of the boundaries of the rural water district, right? So anytime there is a change in the boundary of a rural water district, they have to let our office know. You got to think about that from the perspective of the reason for that is because that then changes their authorized place of use for where they can use water. And so that really is them filing that maybe I've added another 2 sections of my service area. We need to reflect that properly in their water rights and their use. And obviously we have ongoing discussions with any number of rural water districts in the Rural Water Association. When we require a water conservation plan for municipal use, for example, the Rural Water Association primarily does that planning on behalf of the local municipality. So there's a lot of more informal interaction that goes on with the rural water districts, but those are the 2 places where we have statutory responsibility.
You don't monitor the quality of their water like you do a city?
Well, we again, this is one of those places where the Department of Health and Environment is the entity that is in charge of water quality and also of permitting public water supply systems, again, primarily because of the issue with water quality and health. And so they do monitor. They are a municipal system under the KDA statute, and I assume at some point you'll get to hear from KDA and they can explain how they go about that as well. But they are a small city and a rural water district from the perspective of the system and the permitting. They're the same. They have to meet the same requirements. But KDA can tell you the requirements.
It will. We have time for 2 more questions. If we keep him too long here, we'll never get anybody else to come visit with us. So let's continue on. Representative Orr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lewis, for being here, and congratulations on your new assignment.
Thank you.
I am very curious about the rattlesnake impairment and what your vision might be for that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are very curious about that, right? So, you know, I think, well, first and foremost, again, I think we got to make sure we put our role in the right context. And again, I think as Professor Griggs talked about this yesterday, first and foremost, this is a water right to water right issue. The Appropriation Act does not give preference from one use to another. So it does not put industrial subservient to municipal or the other way around, nor does it put irrigation superior or subservient to recreation. This is strictly the only way we can address this under the Appropriation Act is strictly by who got their water right first, right? So we're going to start with that foundation, that this is not irrigation versus recreation or who's. The other thing is that it does not put the state in a position to evaluate what's better for the local economy, right? And I know that's an issue and certainly something that can be debated. You all can debate that. I don't have the ability to debate that at this point. The law prohibits that. It's inappropriate for the chief engineer or the state to pick winners and losers when it comes to the economy, right? That's not the way our water rights system works. Now, coming back to the Rattlesnake Creek, again, I mentioned that I first started working with the Rattlesnake Creek issue in 1992. So this is an ongoing long-term issue. If we go away from Rattlesnake Creek, I expect, and I know that we are aware of many cases where two water right owners that may not agree, but they come to some agreement. We never know about it, right? This comes back to your question of, do we affirmatively go out and try and address water rights, or do we reactively do it? I'm sure that there are situations, I'm not sure how many are out there, where people across the back of the pickup bed or whatever come to some agreement, and it never gets to our office. And that's fine with us, right? If we never had to go out and deal with a water administration, there's nobody in our office that would be upset by that. But we have a duty when they don't work it out, when there is not a local agreement, we still have a responsibility to protect those private property rights in the system that's been established by statute. And so I don't know where we'll end up with this litigation, frankly. Our goal would be that we could all come to some kind of agreement that works best for everybody. I don't know whether that's going to happen. We may be, frankly, just to be straightforward, we may be in a situation at some point where we have to come out and do first in time, first in right administration. And that may mean 450 or 500 circles go off. We don't want that. And we will try and do what we can to make sure that we come to a solution that doesn't do that. But that is always the hard and fast rule of law. And again, we don't want to get in that situation, but again, if that's where we end up, because we can't come to a better solution, then ultimately we have to do our job.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Representative Fairchild.
He basically asked the question I was going to ask, but just to follow up on that, the agreement that was entered into involved water augmentation, pumping water directly into Quivira. I know that your job is simply to enforce the law, but can't the law be enforced through alternatives, rather than just cutting off, people's irrigation water rights? Couldn't it also be enforced through the agreement that they came through water augmentation? And why can't we give that a chance to work before we go through the route of cutting off irrigation?
So two-part answer. First, the answer on can augmentation be a solution or part of the solution, the answer is yes, right? The statute was changed a few years ago to allow augmentation to be used for that very purpose for this situation. So we're hopeful for that. Again, we think that's a good solution. And augmentation has been used in a couple other places. It's used in the Republican, both in Colorado and in Nebraska, to satisfy their compact allocation requirements. And it's been very successful, I think. It gives both, in the Nebraska case, it gives them an opportunity to do just what we're talking about here in the Rattlesnake Creek, comply with their obligations without cutting off very much irrigation. Gives us the ability, as a downstream user, to have some certainty of getting the water we need at a time we need it, so there's some benefit. I think there's a lot of corollary to what is going on in the Rattlesnake Creek. We think that augmentation is a good solution. I think the second part of that is the augmentation as was envisioned adequate to cover the entire impairment obligation? And that I don't know. I don't have an answer. Again, I think that is going to have to play out a little bit. The district is going to have to get moving quickly to get that augmentation in place, to see how much water is available and how it can be used to supplement the supply of Quivira when it's needed. Again, I think that's a good solution. How much is there and for that use? Again, I think, so the question is, can we let that play out? I don't know, right? Again, it's within the court system. It's starting to be within the court system. And so my hope is that we can come to some resolution. Will we have time to do it? I don't know. I'm just being honest here.
I guess I just don't understand the point of the lawsuit before actually allowing that to play out, and why we can't, give that a chance before we, before the lawsuit was filed. I just don't really understand the point of the lawsuit.
Yeah, and well, that's for the other side. Yeah. So.
We really appreciate you coming to see us today. The information was great in a lot of detail. I'm sure there'll be questions later on, and hopefully that we may be able to ask you back to get into some more detail in some of these other areas that we just glossed over a little bit.
You bet. Happy to come back anytime.
Well, thank you very much. Committee, That's our day. We are adjourned.